In this episode, we take up the conscience of the king.
Compliance, the final frontier. Tom Fox is the voyager of trekking through compliance. His mission? To explore the original series and seek out and share what it can teach you about compliance. Here's your host, Tom Fox.
Episode 13, The Conscience of the King. A friend of Captain Kirk, one Thomas Leighton, diverts the Enterprise to Cygna Minor Earth Colony 300, light years off its course, with a phony message. Leighton tells Kirk his suspicion that the actor Anton Karidian is actually Kodos the Executioner, but doesn't live to expand on the allegation as he is murdered shortly after making this report to Kirk. Kirk consults the computer banks and discovers that Karidian's history begins almost exactly where Kodos's ended. Of the 9 witnesses to Kodos's murder of 4,000 colonists on Tarsus IV some 20 years ago, Kirk finds that Leighton, Kevin Riley, and himself were the only survivors. All others are dead. Kirk further finds the deaths of all of the witnesses occurred when the Karidian players were nearby their locations. Hoping to conclusively establish the identity of Karidian, Kirk requests his friend Captain Daly not to pick up the acting company. At the request of Karidian's 19-year-old daughter, Lenore, Kirk then uses the Enterprise to take them to the Benicia colony some 8 light years out of the way of the Enterprise's path. While the players are aboard, Riley's milk is poisoned and a phaser on overload is hidden in Kirk's room. Kirk confronts Karidian, but is not conclusively convinced of his guilt. After Riley escapes from sickbay and tries to kill Karidian, Kirk overhears the psychopathic Lenore telling her father it was she who's been killing the eyewitnesses to his deeds of the past. Kirk tries to take Lenore into custody, but she grabs a phaser from a security guard. She tries to shoot Kirk, but her father takes the fatal phaser blast intended for Kirk. And in the last scene, Lenore goes insane. If you like Shakespeare, this was an episode for you. Obviously, the references are replete throughout this play, both references to Macbeth, the reference to Hamlet are great scenes in this episode. Interestingly, in a scene filmed but later cut, the action indicated, or the narration, I should say, indicated that Kirk was fresh out of the academy some 20 years ago when the massacre at Tarsus IV occurred. That's a little bit different than the timeline we heard on, or will hear rather, in a later show, The Deadly Years. But this one really was enjoyable. The performances, I thought, particularly the performances of the Shakespeare, were something that everyone would enjoy. Lenore going crazy, insane, was a really interesting portrayal of just how deep and dark the mind could go. So a little bit different in this direction, or this episode, the direction we went, but I give it a thumbs up, and I hope you will watch and enjoy this episode. Today, rather than compliance lessons learned on this episode, it is so unique, I thought I might look at the ethical dilemma of balancing justice and mercy, which is the central theme of this episode as it plays out in the complex treatment of the character Kodos Karidian. On the one hand, Kodos is clearly guilty of a heinous crime, the mass execution of thousands of innocent civilians in order to ration limited resources. This act of premeditated large-scale murder represents an unambiguous violation of the most fundamental and ethical principles of humanity. From a strict standpoint of retributive justice, Kodos deserves to be held fully accountable for this atrocity, with no possibility for leniency or forgiveness. However, the episode complicates this clear-cut view of justice by introducing the character of Karidian, the Shakespeare actor who may in fact be the same person as the war criminal Kodos, but who has seemingly redeemed himself and is living a productive, even benevolent life. This raises the difficult questions about the nature of moral culpability and the possibility of redemption. Should Karidian be condemned in perpetuity for the sins of his past self, i.e. Kodos? Or is there a case to be made that his subsequent decades of peaceful artistic endeavors have in some way absolved him of it, or at least mitigated his earlier transgressions? This episode did not provide a definitive answer, but rather forces the viewer to grapple with ethical quandaries. Ultimately, the dilemma boils down to how to weigh the competing moral imperatives of justice and mercy. Of course, for the compliance professional, as I've mentioned already, you're the holder of institutional justice and institutional fairness in an organization. It won't come down to something this stark, but it's only on the edges, or rather the very outskirts of a debate, do you really learn what should be in the center. On the one hand, there's a strong argument that Kodos' mass murder was an unforgivable crime against humanity that demands a reckoning, regardless of any subsequent good deeds. Upholding the integrity of ethical norms and the rule of law would seem to necessitate Kodos being held fully accountable, indeed even being executed. On the other hand, the episode suggests that Karidian has undergone a genuine transformation, and that continuing to punish him for his past sins may not serve a greater moral purpose. Perhaps, as the argument goes, mercy and the opportunity for redemption are essential components of a truly ethical framework. After all, what is the purpose of justice if not to leave room for rehabilitation and moral growth? The ethical crux that this episode leaves the viewer to ponder. There are valid arguments on both sides, and the clear-cut resolution mirrors the real-world complexity, or rather the lack of a clear-cut resolution mirrors the real-world complexity that leaders, policymakers, corporate executives, and even compliance professionals must grapple with when dealing with issues of crime punishment and the possibility of forgiveness. Even in the compliance space, there are former convicted felons out talking about their journey, their struggles, and how they have been redeemed. It's a thought-provoking exploration of the profound tension between justice and mercy. So I hope you'll join me again tomorrow for our next episode, which is The Balance of Terror. This is Tom Fox. Thank you for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode of Trekking Through Compliance, you can help it grow by sharing it with the biggest Trek fan you know.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.